Okay, so good evening, everybody. So well done to those who have submitted their assignments on time, which is great. I think everybody has actually. I had a squeeze through all of the assignments. Um, just to give you an indication, um, your assignment, I'm going to start grading over this weekend. I'm probably going to start and finish this weekend. So hopefully by early next week, you will have your results. I'll capture it onto the student portal as well as on ARC. And it should be basically when I get confirmation from results team, then I will submit the release. Okay, so just so that you know, so let's say by latest next week Thursday, by the time we have our next session, next week Thursday, you should have your results by then. Yeah, I think that should be it. So today's session, we are going to continue our learning unit 3, which we are then going into theme 2, which is your more so from a demand planning perspective and a purchasing and procurement perspective. A long session. I'm going to try and not keep you too long. But if you have any questions, please stop me, ask me, and we will take it from there. So as we begin, we need to understand firstly how demand planning. Remember in our last session, we spoke about forecasting. So demand planning, how it's linked to forecasting specifically. So when we're talking about demand planning, quite an important aspect of supply chain management. So you want to be able to forecast what your customers' future demand is for the products and services that you basically offer. So a lot of the different applications of demand planning is what we're going to discuss right now. And one of it, or the first one, is forecasting demand. So when we're talking about demand planning, a lot of it begins with understanding where your future demand is based on historical data, the market trends that's happening, the different seasonalities. So businesses use the statistical methods like your time series that we had gone through in the previous session, and the different algorithms in order for them to generate accurate demand forecasts or demand plannings for different products or different markets or different segments that they're now looking into. Then we have how demand planning basically guides inventory management. So a lot of the decisions from an inventory management perspective, it basically helps with optimizing inventory levels, so making sure that you don't have too much of stock and too little stock. What's your safety stock requirements that you require, as well as what your reorder points is based on your forecasted demand and the different service levels. So your reorder points is based on your demand and your supply and how much of sales you are um, um, interpreting that you may get or forecasting that you may get. Based on that, how often do you now need to reorder or produce that particular stock? So when you have that sort of alignment in terms of inventory levels, you don't have excess of stock. You minimize your stockouts as much as possible. Remember that your cash sits in the stock that you have that sits on shelves. So you minimize your carrying costs as much as possible. And also products that have an expiration date, so obsolete products. So just to make sure that you're not sitting with those on the shelf that cannot sell. So demand planning does help you coach into inventory management. Then we have production planning, where you basically translating your demand forecast into a production plan itself, understanding how much of materials you require and how much of capacity you're going to be utilizing. So when you align these production schedules with your forecasted demand planning, there can be a lot of efficiency. You can reduce a lot of your lead time and also minimize anything from a production bottleneck perspective. So you're meeting your customers' demand in a timely manner at the end of the day. Um, Demand planning also contributes to supply chain optimization because you're synchronizing your supply with your demand across the entire value chain. You're including suppliers, manufacturers, your distributors, your retailers. And by sharing your demand forecast and collaborating with these partners, your business can basically improve the supply chain. Your visibility in your supply chain, your responsiveness, you can reduce any like unforeseen disruptions or stock outs where you'd end up with no inventory at all. So just your overall supply chain performance can be optimized as much as possible. Um, Demand planning also supports your promotional planning and pricing strategies because you are forecasting the impact of promotions, discounts, pricing, anything from where you have changes in market demand and sales volume, because you're integrating your demand forecast with your promotional calendar or your marketing calendar, and um, therefore your business can optimize on their promotional investment. They can make sure that they maximize any sales revenue, improve the profitability, and then you have better brand value, better reputational image as well. Demand planning can also facilitate new product introductions into the market because you're forecasting for new products, you're phasing out old, like obsolete products, and you're also managing your transitions productively or effectively. Um, Demand planning can also enhance your customer relationship management because you are trying to align your supply chain operations with how your customer demand patterns work. What is their preferences? What is the service that they are expecting? So you, by analyzing your customer segmentation, how your customer orders, and the variability in terms of demand, businesses can tailor their inventory policies accordingly, just so that there's better loyalty and better customer satisfaction. And then lastly, demand planning involves continuous improvement, making sure that you have performance monitoring by using KPIs, so key performance indicators, so you can forecast any errors in your matrix for your demand planning. Anything from a service level perspective, what is your inventory turnover ratio? Um, because you can identify these areas for improvement, you can refine your forecasting models and make sure that you have better accuracy the next time. Okay. Then we're going into something called CPFR. Okay, so which is basically collaborative planning and forecasting replenishment. So CPFR, and basically this is a sort of a business practice that involves collaboration amongst a whole host of different trading partners so that you have a more improved demand forecast accuracy. You can optimize your inventory levels as much as possible. And also your supply chain has a lot more efficiency. So when we're talking about improving your forecast accuracy, because of the collaborative forecasting, because you are sharing your demand data, your market insights, and any sort of business intelligence amongst the different trading partners, you're pooling all your resources and your expertise together. There can be a a much better development of an accurate demand forecast that reflects market dynamics, it reflects your customer preferences. So it just becomes a whole host of easier, more fundamental ways of working that allows you to better forecast or accurately forecast. Um, CPFR also helps businesses to synchronize inventory levels from an optimization perspective based on the forecasting demand and the supply chain requirements. So when you're aligning your inventory policies, your safety stock levels, and you know how much you need to replenish at the end of the day, the different trading partners can help reduce the excess inventory and minimize the stockouts, giving you better cash flow efficiency. Because there's a lot more communication, collaborative between partners, suppliers, etc. It does show for uh, a better long-term effect. CPFR can also um, streamline your supply chain operations by reducing your cycle time, reducing your lead time, um, and they do this by improving the demand visibility, improving communication between the partners. Because they're sharing the demand forecast and production plans, businesses can respond quite quickly when there's a change in customer demand, change in production scheduling, and then sort of try and minimize as much of the disruption and the delays as possible. CPFR can also be involved in, from a cost saving perspective, um, because you're optimizing your inventory level, you're reducing stockouts as much as possible, and also you're minimizing your carrying cost. So when you're synchronizing and creating an equilibrium between your supply and demand, businesses can reduce your inventory holding cost itself, transportation costs, how much it takes to process an order, so your order processing costs. All of these can improve your efficiency in your supply chain. Then we have risk mitigation and enhancing resilience, because you are addressing, you know, disruptions and bottlenecks and anything that creating vulnerability in your supply chain. You are collaborating on risk assessment, contingency plans with your trading partners. And then the last one is fostering a strategic partnership and a strategic alliance with your trading partners, promoting transparency, promoting collaboration, promoting sharing of information, of risk, of resources. All of these can create a value-added synergy for long-term growth at the end of the day. Okay, so that's CPFR. Then we're going into the difference between purchasing and procurement. So when I first understood a little bit about purchasing and a little bit about procurement, I couldn't tell the difference between them both, but there is quite a substantial difference that differentiates the both terminologies. So when we're looking at purchasing itself, purchasing is quite transactional. And it is the process of buying a good or a service from a supplier in order for you to meet your operational need at that specific time. So it basically, some of the activities are you placing an order with the supplier, you're negotiating the price, and then you're managing that supplier's relationship. So purchasing, the focus becomes on executing individual transactions efficiently and cost effectively within an established perimeter that your business basically sets out. Whereas procurement, on the other hand, is much more broader in that sense, because as much as it is involving the purchasing of and services to support the business's goals or the business's objectives, it's a lot more strategic. So strategic planning, supplier selection, going through contract negotiation, understanding what is the risk management of using that specific supplier, and then running supplier performance management, like KPIs with the suppliers on an ongoing basis. So procurement basically is a lot more of a holistic approach to sourcing and supply management, because you are now aligning your procurement strategies with different objectives, etc. Okay, so when we're looking at procurement itself, we want to understand why do we think that procurement is important. So when we're looking at procurement, number one is from a cost reduction perspective. So you can understand, because you are running through a strategic process with the supplier, you are asking them different areas of questions, economies of scale being one of that. You're negotiating favorable terms, because you're optimizing your sourcing strategies itself. You sort of making sure that you are securing competitive pricing, you're minimizing as much cost as possible, and you're getting a maximized value for money across your entire supply chain. And that's all because you are aligning yourself with the supplier that is giving you a better per unit rate because of it being economies of scale, but they're also ticking the boxes in other aspects. So when we're looking at something from a supply chain efficiency perspective, you want to ensure that your goods are, or your services is available at a timely fashion. You want to optimize your inventory levels. You want to minimize your disruptions, because when you have an effective procurement practice, you streamline your sourcing processes. So then your supplier collaboration becomes a lot more favorable. Your supply chain becomes a lot more visible. It becomes a lot more agile and resilient at the end of the day. Procurement also pushes quality and compliance, because you have regulatory requirements that you set out in your RFP or RFQ. When you are onboarding a supplier, you are selecting reputable suppliers that are implementing quality processes. You're monitoring your suppliers' performance. Therefore, you end up with better quality standards. And you're able to also mitigate quality related risk, so that you have better integrity, you have better safety, etc. Procurement also drives innovation, also drives value creation, because you are forming strategic partnerships with the suppliers, you're promoting a lot of supplier collaboration, and you're integrating supplier sort of expertise into your production process or your product development process. You are able to have access to new technologies, different market insights, because your supplier is probably very well versed in from a global perspective. And you can bring in enhancement for product differentiation, in order to give you that competitive edge in the market. Procurement also manages anything from a supply chain risk perspective, so that you have better resilience, because you are identifying threats, you are putting together strategies for risk mitigation within your supplier base. You are it basically pushes you from a procurement perspective to access suppliers' risk profiles. So you have first-hand knowledge of where they're sitting at from a risk perspective. You can monitor different market trends, and then you have contingency plans in order to mitigate any risks that may come into play. Then we have CSR, so corporate social responsibility or sustainability. And here you want to be able to onboard suppliers that are more environmentally cautious, or environmentally responsible. Maybe they're promoting better ethical labor practices. They're also supporting a lot more sustainability initiatives in the supply chain. So taking all of these factors into account, better carbon emissions, green supply chain, um, um, pushing through better carbon footprints. They can also practice, both from an environmental or a social or ethical factors in that, selection process, in order for you to have better, corporate reputation in the market and the community as well. And then the last one here is called strategic alignment. It's where procurement aligns with the business's goals and objective by integrating the strategies from a procurement perspective with the business strategies and the entire value chain in total. Um, because you're aligning all of this, you end up having better strategy across the entire business, better value creation amongst the entire business, and your suppliers also see what your worth is at the end of the day. So that's basically why procurement is important. Then you would have remembered we had gone through the different types of forecasting, quantitative, qualitative, hybrid. So very similarly, from a purchasing perspective, we're going through something called centralized, decentralized, and then hybrid, just so that you have an understanding of, sort of the pros and the cons when it comes to these sort of items. So the first one is centralized, and it goes with the name. Basically, in the centralized sort of purchasing approach, a lot of this is consolidated and managed by a central procurement department within the business. So most often than not, situated in HQ. So all the purchasing decisions, the negotiations, managing the supplier relationships, all of this is coordinated from a central perspective through their policies, their procedures, and any sort of guidelines that they set out. Some of the pros and cons, obviously from an advantage perspective, you have economies of scale. Because you are a central purchasing unit, you're able to leverage on volume discounts, negotiate better favorable terms, achieve different cost savings by consolidating your volumes across departments or across business units. So your per unit cost then becomes a lot cheaper. Like for instance, if you are a business that has multiple branches across the country, let's say you have a centralized grocery bill that you order from a particular company. Instead of you ordering 2 just for your branch sitting in, let's say, George, you're now ordering 100, and you're now from a Johannesburg perspective, and you're now distributing it across the country. So you end up having a better per unit rate because you are now centralizing your purchase. Disadvantage, though, is that you do lack some sort of flexibility because it's more from a central perspective. You don't have responsiveness from a regional or a branch perspective. So you end up sitting with a lot of delays. You end up with inefficiencies and sometimes dissatisfaction amongst end users. So like in my business, for instance, all of our groceries is a central purchasing point. I don't have a grocer here or a company here that I purchase groceries from. I purchase it using our online system, and it goes through to our Johannesburg office if I'm the procurement side. They then place a bulk order, and then everything gets delivered to Johannesburg, and then they split the order according to which branches it needs to go to, and then obviously delivery then takes place. My problem is that I end up having a lot of delays. If I place my order today, it'll only end up coming to me sometimes 10, 11 days later. At that time, I have already run out of milk, I've already run out of tea bags, and I've already run out of coffee. So I end up placing a check 60/60 order. and I end up basically restocking for those few days that I don't have any stock. So there's pros, there's cons, but sometimes you end up looking at something that's more from a decentralized perspective. So as you can understand, decentralized meaning that it is managed by an individual branch or an individual unit, um, or an individual location where that specific department or unit has decisions to make that purchasing, um, uh, or has the authority to make those purchasing decisions. They can negotiate their own contracts, they can manage the supplier relationship and all of those. Okay. Advantage here is from a local knowledge perspective. If I if people are sitting in Johannesburg, they can tell me who's the best and closest plumber or electrician that I have sitting in Durban. So having that in-depth knowledge of that local market and what the suppliers are capable in that specific town um, allows me to make a better, more informed decision um, in order for me to drive, better supplier innovation at the end of the day. The disadvantage to this is duplication inefficiencies. So there can be duplication of effort. You can have something from a fragmented supplier relationship, um, which can lead to higher costs. You don't have economies of scale. You also have some sort of inconsistencies in terms of supplier management. You also don't have visibility. You don't have that much of control. You also need somebody to manage the process when it's decentralized. You manage each and every supplier in-house where you're sitting at from that specific location. Okay. And then the last one is our hybrid purchasing. So hybrid, as you know, goes with the name. It's a combination between your centralized as well as your decentralized, so that you have some sort of balance in terms of decision making stuff. So an advantage of this is the risk mitigation with having a centralized uh, procurement, um, especially when it's critical procurement activities, whilst decentralizing your less strategic ones. So in my old business, that's what we used to do. So bigger items like groceries, etc., we would then do it as centralized order, and anything that had to do with fixer-uppers in the branch, plumbing, electricity, or electricity, electrical, um, uh, wastage, um, those sort of items, all of that we had decentralized those options. Some of the complexities that are surrounding it is managing all of these procurement models. So a lot of businesses now are going into the no purchase order, no pay scenario. So every single order or every single payment you make out needs the purchase order. So you need someone to then control that specific process. If it's not controlled, it ends up falling very short, and you end up basically probably losing a lot more money than you would have thought you would. So that's basically what hybrid purchasing is. I am always sort of leaning towards hybrid purchasing as long as you have someone that's helping you control it or a system to control it. Then I would go towards the hybrid purchasing. And that's just from my time of, managing branches, etc. I just saw that seemed a lot more fruitful for me, as opposed to the centralized or the decentralized options. Okay, and that basically almost takes us to the end. The last page is I just put together a little screenshot here, but just on a purchasing process. My apologies, that went a little bit too small. And just so that you have an understanding, I mean, this is absolutely self-explanatory when we're looking at a purchasing process if you have to put yourself into the situation. But the first one is understanding what the need of that specific purchase is. Then choosing a supplier or multiple suppliers, finding out what their prices are, when your item would be ready, placing your order, following up and following through with it, then receiving it, distributing it, handling any sort of errors if there is a mismanagement of that specific order, and then reviewing your invoice, making payments, and then closing it off. And just the various documents that is required. This is not um, a prerequisite to know and understand, but sometimes it is helpful because, especially if you need to know from a procurement perspective, where the documents and sources of information for each step come from, just so that you know where it comes from and then who is then responsible for that specific process or that specific step. Okay, and that basically takes us to the end of learning unit uh, 3, theme 2. In our next session, we're going to go over theme 3. So as you can see, because you're having a lecture once a week, it's very nicely spaced out, which gives you enough time to actually spend, reading into the topic or into the paragraph and looking at various different examples for it as well. Is there any questions that you have for me? No questions. I mean, learning unit 2 is pretty simple. Purchasing and procurement. It does give you a good indication of what the both those items are. So read up on it, go through it in your textbook, and hopefully in next week's session, because we'll be done with our assignment, I'm going to use the first half of that session to go over something from what I'd like to do from a review perspective on the assignment. So just how you should have answered it, if that makes sense. Just so that you do and then you learn after. And then we can do a Q&A and then run through our Learning Unit 3, Theme 3 at the end of that session. Okay, there's no questions. Thank you very much. And we will catch up next week. Have a good evening. Bye.